Perfect. All right. And now we watch people roll into the Zoom room, which is always an interesting yeah, I'll never understand it. It's yeah. So let's just let the rising tide happen. And we'll just wait a minute.
I think that this has to do that this is an intentional feature of Zoom that people kind of roll in slowly, or does it have more to do with people's like internet speeds and the point at which they click
I
the
think there's
URL?
probably a little from column A and a lot from column B, which is that they're probably just sorting out the connectivity issues. And yeah, and so we'll see. We will see how that all works out. I usually have people's bios in front of me. Let me grab those too. Okay, so without further ado, welcome everybody to another webinar, seminar, Big If True. I selected this this very provocative quote from Anna Wiener's book Uncanny Valley to be the title today. What if we limited our sample to white people? Because I just felt like that was a really interesting kicker for one of the chapters in the book that covers um, quite a bit about what would make a very boring book, which is the way in which tech cultures operate and how the way that people socialize and get to know one another actually shape the technology itself. They shape the goals of corporations. It shapes the nature of the innovation itself. And so today we're going to be talking about questions around how do technology platforms treat their employees and their users, and how do you write about that? I think that Anna Wiener's experience has been one that is really interesting to me as someone who's a scholar. I've read this book Uncanny Valley much like I would read an ethnography, a um deep experiential, like you kind of felt like you were there reading, but at the same time periodically coming up for air to express a little bit of anger, a little bit of rage, a little bit of confusion about what else was going on related to the corporate culture of extravagance, the nature of workplace hierarchies, racism and misogyny as well. Every once in a while on Big If True, Dr. Chris Gilliard is going to join us as a co-host. He's currently a fellow here at the Shorenstein Center with the Technology and Social Change Research Project, which I'm the director of. I'm Joan Donovan. And the reason why Chris and I have been interested in working together on a few different podcast topics is because of the ways in which his research and my research come into contact with one another around the nature of what is a user, what is technology good for, is it good for anything, and of course the way that privacy and surveillance intersect with race, class, and technology. And so I would be remiss to not mention, though, that he's also had his ideas featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wired, Chronicle of Higher Ed, as well as Vice. Anna, as well, is a contributing writer to the New Yorker and has produced this. You don't get that little patch at the top, that little badge on it, the New York Times bestseller, for not doing a thing. Okay, so serious business today. And so I am going to shepherd us through some of this conversation, but today is going to be a bit more freewheeling. And so if you want to ask a question, feel free to put it in the Q&A, and I will work it into the topic at hand. And so if you're listening along, just drop it in there, and we will work it out. And I was gonna give you, Chris, the honor of kicking us off. What do you think?
Oh, thank you, and thanks for that introduction. Um, so Anna, and thanks for joining us. I'm gonna jump right into the deep end. I want to refer to a point in the book where you talk about an experience with where you're talking to people about a self-driving car. Um, and if you could kind of talk about a little bit about this story, because I think it illustrates a lot about the culture. Um, and I think it's sort of part horror story, part comedy, but speaks volumes to kind of what you experienced, and in some ways what a lot of us experience when it comes to tech. So yeah, if you could expand on that and tell us a little bit about it, that'd be fantastic.
Sure. Thanks. And thanks to both of you, Chris and Joan, for having me. So I should note, I guess, two things, because a couple people have noted this in the chat. Chris has his camera off intentionally, so if you can't see him, that's on purpose. So my book, Uncanny Valley, is a memoir. It's not an ethnography. So I just want to be very clear that it's just my personal observations and experiences rather than a piece of academic research. And the scene that Chris is referring to is actually one of the reasons why, I mean, among many others, why I wrote the book as nonfiction rather than as fiction, which would have been, I think, in many ways a sort of safer, freer form. This was a situation that I felt, if I had read it in a novel, or if I had written it into a novel, it would not be believable, which kind of characterized much of my experience working in Silicon Valley in the 2010s. And so the story is really short and simple. I was at a party that was at the sort of workshop office space of a robotics company, and I was in a conversation with a bunch of men. I'd sort of been left there, as one does at a party after a beer. I was sort of being a little bit. I felt left out of the conversation. They all worked in robotics and were talking about their different projects, and I, at the time, was working in customer support and at a data analytics company. And they were talking about self-driving cars. This was maybe 2013 or 2014. I can't remember. I think 2013. And at the time, self-driving cars were really considered inevitable. I mean, people were talking about having them on the streets within the next decade in a very major way. And I think that a lot of that rhetoric has been dampened by the reality of self-driving cars and all of the the sort of obviousness of their what they're lacking. Although I do think the technology, people are still working on it, obviously, but there's some air has been let out of that balloon. And I sort of was agitating because I felt that the conversation was like a little unrealistic, and I was being a little bit, I felt that also I was being talked down to because I was a woman, because I was, working in customer support and not in software. And as I was going home with my partner, who brought me to the party, who himself works in robotics, I was sort of saying, like, they were so condescending to me because I'm a woman, because I don't work in a technical role. And he was like, Anna, you were trying to shit talk self-driving cars to some of the people who built like the very first one. So I felt that sort of encapsulated this experience that I often had as, it's an anecdote to make fun of myself as much as anyone else, right? That I was so accustomed to being sort of an outsider because of my non-technical, quote unquote, non-technical role, because I was a woman, that I assumed that this is why I was sort of being condescended to. But actually, in reality, these are people who really did know what they were talking about, even if the rhetoric around it was overblown. And so I think, that particular anecdote just sort of highlighted both the absurdity and the what did you say? You said it was both horror and comedy. I mean, I think that sort of is like sums up a lot of things that
Yeah.
I experienced around this time and to this day. But
I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
no, please go.
Well, so one of a little piece that you left out that I think was important was about how kids were playing
Oh.
in front of the cars because they didn't have enough training data of what of basically they needed imagery so that the cars wouldn't run over little kids.
Yes. Yes, sorry. This was not at that party. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I should have just read the scene. I feel like I spoke for as long as it would have taken me to just read it. But right. That there had been like a take your children to work day, and they had the kids run around and play around the cars to build out the training data set. So this, again, like, this is where I really want to be clear that this is memoir and not a reported piece or an academic work, because this is a story that was told to me. I wasn't there. I didn't see it happening, and I believe it to be true, and I'm almost certain that it is true, but I don't have any insight into like what data set that they had previously. Had there ever been a child in front of a self-driving car? I have no idea. But the idea that you would have your colleagues' kids come in and roll around and play and like trigger the sensors, I just thought was so, it's like shockingly ad hoc.
Yeah, I mean,
I assume is what you're responding to as well.
yeah, there has been some reporting on similar instances,
Mm-hmm.
right? Not necessarily those particular people, but I think too it speaks to the ways. I mean, much of the rhetoric, as you say, is overblown. And I think it speaks to a lot of how I understand the book, which is about how people who are supposedly non-technical or not in a particular field are diminished. Um, Even when technical folks make really fanciful claims about what tech can and can't do. Um, and I think to sort of spin that out to the larger conversation. I mean, I see this a lot. I think Joan sees this a lot as well.
Mm-hmm.
As people who are not necessarily tech based, but who comment and critique on technology. So yeah, I just think that scene illustrates so much.
I mean, it's funny that you bring this up first, because I was on that Clubhouse the other night where the New York Times was lamenting why technology companies hate them. And there was, there's a laundry list of reasons why there's not great rapport between tech reporters and technologists. And one thing that did come up in that conversation, which this is reminding me of, is the question of, do journalists need to know basically how to code, as Brandy Zadronsky put it in that chat room. I don't even know how to talk about Clubhouse yet. It's like a teenage party line. I keep joking that it's all gonna turn into fart noises eventually, like if it's a really good app, of course. So Brandy brings up this point that a lot of the tech folks on the Clubhouse main stage, what have you, were saying, yeah, you got to know how the product works. You got to know the ins and outs. You can't report on AI. You can't do this, can't do that. And then the reporters realized, I think Brandy actually realized pretty quickly, that they didn't understand how news gathering works, and that you don't just, there are people that end up in your story, but there's actually a whole bunch of other stuff you need to do in order to make sense of a phenomenon that you're reporting on. And so this conversation is kind of reminding me of this, which it was just kind of funny, because the tech folks really were eager to say, you don't know how to report on us. And then but there was this just imagined reporter that just takes whatever a PR company gives them and regurgitates it. And so I would like to ask both of you, because Chris, you do a little bit of reporting here and there about tech. Like, how important is this anecdata, this kind of these stories that we hear that, you might end up hearing the same kind of story from a few different people? How does that factor into how we end up doing journalism or opinion pieces about technology? And how does that then shape how the culture understands technology? Anna, did you want to?
Sure, that's a really good question. I mean, there are so many different things to respond to in that. I think just to go back to the beginning of what you're saying about this, like people writing about tech should know how to code, should understand the inner workings of the technology itself. This seems like the sort of simplest and most aggressive distillation of that is the sentiment that I hear quite a lot from people with influence and power in the industry, which is don't critique, build. This idea that actually you can't have any input on a matter unless you yourself have engaged in it, or that critics are a dragnet and the real future is in building. I think that verb in and of itself is very interesting, but that's probably another topic for another time. But I think that, and I think that these, like, there is this idea too that, I guess when we're talking about tech and we're talking about technical and non-technical and who's building and who's critiquing, I think it really helps to separate like the executive and founder and VC class from the sort of everyday people working at these companies. I think that there's, I would say also on the sort of critics side, there is this sentiment among a lot of people that like engineers just need to take a humanities course. And I don't think that that's right either. In the same way that I don't think a journalist needs to, have a master's degree in CS to be able to report on an industry, because there's so much in an industry that actually, that has a relationship to the technology, but has nothing to do with the code base. So that's the workplace environment, that's the business model, that's the social networks. I mean, that like not in a digital way, although those are tied into the sort of interpersonal networks in Silicon Valley, obviously. All of these are really important. And I think that like the technology is shaped by them. And so I don't want to discount that the relevance of the code base, which I'm using as sort of an abstract concept, but I think that to only focus on some sort of imaginary technical skill set is kind of a distraction from what technology actually is, how it operates, and how the people building it, think and interact, and what their idea for the world is, or what the world is, or what it should be. And I think that that's why, to go to the title of this talk, why that particular conversation, I put it in the book, because it said something about the intellectual culture of Silicon Valley, which is so deeply tied to like message board culture, internet culture. So in terms of these anecdotes about, what happens at a party or what happens in a workplace, I think that, like any anecdata, you have to be careful about how much weight you give to it, which is why I've been emphasizing that my book is a memoir. Like I wasn't, it's who wrote there's a great book by Alice Marwick, that's an ethnography of like
Status update.
Status update, yeah. And it's a really different approach. And so, this is just my life. But I think that often the things that happen in a workplace are revealing of the values of that work environment, and the values of the work environment are shaped by the values of the business or the industry, and the values of the industry are shaped by the business models. And so not to be too like everything is connected, and like not to take like the LSD approach to writing about Silicon Valley, but I do think that, you can do sort of a close read of any little interaction, and usually infer quite a lot about the broader culture, which is not to like overemphasize every little thing, but I do think that there's important relationships there. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's really tremendous power in narrative, right? And I think that in so many ways, I think intentionally, but also otherwise, when we hear stories either told by some of these folks at companies like who started them or consider themselves builders or what have you, but also people who work in the companies in whatever fashion, I think the stories reveal a lot. One of the things I'm really interested in is just listening to folks who invented things tell the story of how they came to invent it. Um, I have some theories about it, which I maybe I don't know if I should share right now.
Please, please, now is the time.
You
Now
mean
is
Okay,
like
the
the
time.
origin
so
story? Like the myth
Yeah, the
yes,
story?
origin
yes.
stories are awesome.
Yeah.
They're
So
awesome.
I've put this out on Twitter, so it's not like a secret, right? But um, my running joke is if you look at say the guy who invented the Ring doorbell, or if you look at um in their own words, the words of some of these folks, uh their origin stories sound very much like supervillain origin stories. Like there's a prominent VC guy, and if you read his own words, he sounds like it's like the Kingpin's origin story, you know. So that I think, and I don't think, in sort of in the way that everyone thinks they're the hero of their own story. Like I don't think they think, pardon me, I don't think they think they're telling a supervillain origin story. But then if you look at the effects of those technologies on the communities they're deployed on and against, they very much turn into that. And that speaks to the other thing you said, Anna, which is that sort of don't critique build. And don't critique build has kind of gotten us where we are in some really unfortunate is not exactly the right word, but in some really dangerous and problematic ways, because in the ways that they understand sort of technical systems, they don't understand communities or what marginalized communities go through or things like that, and then yeah, we get what we have now.
It's interesting that you used the word deployed too, because Madeline Ellish has, also done a lot of great work, ethnographies of AI systems, and this idea that deployed now is a bit of a dirty word. So we're starting to hear more about AI and integration, right? And that has a history too, right? Um, and as we think about the way in which technologists seek to bring technology into the world, I think those origin stories are really important, especially when I explain to people a little bit about, when I teach this class on media manipulation, disinformation, I ask people, do you know what Facebook was? And if they had watched the Social Network, they have some idea that it comes from this hot or not style site, which probably doesn't even mean anything to younger folks these days. But back when I was young and hip, websites that rated people based on their looks, you couldn't date them. You could just rate them. That was it. There was no there's nothing else out there. But the idea that you would get everybody's school pictures and you'd put them up online, and then other people could rate them as the Facebook. Um, that's very different from the origin story that Zuckerberg was trying to tell in 2019 about how he really just wanted a forum where people could debate war and become anti-war. And I was just like, well, I probably would have joined that website. That sounds like what I would have been into. But sadly, that's not the origin story that they meant to put into the world. And I bring that up because I'm interested in the way too that both of you in your research and your journalism, you give a lot of room for space and place. So it's not just the the words that people say. I'll tell you, Anna, when I was reading your piece on signal and encryption, I was walking in Venice Beach with you. Like, I knew everything you were talking about. I was like, right, I felt like I was right there. And one of the things that I feel like your book does as well is sets up the scene in a way that people aren't, so it doesn't feel so unfamiliar. And the notion of the open workspace, right? And the way in which then there's this kind of creeping surveillance, but you don't realize that everybody's kind of keeping an eye on one another. And Chris, and in your work, of course, the way in which how technology becomes built into the space, and so as to change the social relationships within it, because of the way the technology is now designed as a feature. And I know that's not a cogent question, but I would love to hear from both of you more about how do we think through, when we're talking about technology and we're talking about technological change, how do we also root it in a place and in a time, so that, you know, down the line, we have these histories, because I feel like a lot of this stuff is going to get rewritten, until, you know, those who have power have written the story of themselves that they feel comfortable leaving as a legacy. But I see both of your work as a kind of counter history of technology. So I'd love to hear some comments on that. Chris, do you want to go first?
I was hoping Anna would go first, but I also
Yeah.
I wanna you said we could do anything, Joan. So I'm gonna
Okay.
like press a pause because I
Okay.
want to go back to something else about Anna's book, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So there's a point in the end, and so we were talking about narrative and stories, and there's a point, you know, and I think the progress narrative about tech has been amazingly powerful in the ways it's been used, basically for tech folks to get their way, and to, you know, let tech run wild on society. There's a part in your book where you say, um, tech for the most part wasn't progressed, it was just a business. And I wonder if you could kind of speak to that a little bit, and the difference between sort of that the progress narrative and what you eventually say is just a business.
Yeah, I think the progress narrative really ties into this question actually that Joan is asking about place and scene and human characterization or depiction, and also what we're talking about with the narrative origin and sort of mythology around tech. Um, you know, and specifically in my book, what I'm writing about is information technology. I'm writing about the app economy. I'm writing about social media, ad tech. I'm not really touching on, you know, biotech or some of the advancements that are being made in you know, medical instruments or robotics. It's really the version of Silicon Valley, or the layer of it that most consumers are familiar with, because it's reshaping labor and it's reshaping communication. And you know, this, so I guess I just want to, that's sort of what I'm focused on, because I do think some progress is being made in other realms, probably like in biotech, not in the Theranos universe, but I think that it's this view of technology as sort of like that technological advancement is inherently progress, and that all technological advancement is positive because all progress is positive. And I think that treating these companies as businesses is actually like one of the most reasonable things that we can do, and one of the easiest ways to demystify some of these industry, you know, some of the industry narratives. And you know, these are very self-serving narratives, in the same way that journalists should learn to code as a self-serving narrative, because it kind of pulls technology or programming into the realm of this black box. And actually, the concepts can be explained. It's not a black box. people who are good communicators can explain to you how an algorithm functions. So I think that the progress narrative, what it's missing, as in, as with most of the missions of companies that purport to be changing the world or fixing the world. I mean, I've sort of noticed like recently the conversation is about repair rather than change, which is kind of interesting. But, it's like progress for whom? Changing the world for whom? Fixing the world for whom? To what ends? Who benefits? Who's on the losing end of this of this narrative? And I think that that's why it's also important to pay attention to the politics and to the intellectual culture of the people driving these companies, because often their vision of what progress would mean is quite at odds with my personal understanding of what progress could mean. And that does come down to politics, I think, in a lot of ways. But it also comes down to evaluating ideas of progress in kind of a vacuum, versus trying to contextualize them outside of an industry or outside of like a social milieu. So that's kind of a lot. I guess I just think that looking at the companies as businesses illuminates a lot. It sort of pulls apart the rhetoric, and it pulls apart, it illuminates how companies are organized internally. And it's so simple and obvious, but I think that for years, part of the backlash against the media right now has to do with how generous the media was to Silicon Valley, and how I guess I would say like cooperative it was, pretty much until like 2015-ish. And I mean that the mainstream media, obviously there have always been critics. I would say that most of the critics who were talking about the potential harms of what Silicon Valley was making and building, promoting, were sidelined or ignored, and that's its own issue. But people really bought these stories wholesale, and I think part of that is because they either weren't taking Silicon Valley seriously enough, these companies seriously enough, because they were sort of wrapped up in this mythology of like young white dropout from Stanford who like dresses casually, starts something that a lot of people are using, and like, by the way, there's like the funding model for this is challenging and disturbing, but like we're not going to get into that. I think that that business reporting is not as sexy and exciting as some of these like narratives about Silicon Valley, but it can be extremely useful in just analyzing what's actually happening and what the end game is. That was a very long answer. I'm sorry, Chris. How do you see it?
No, I mean,
what do you think?
well, thanks for that. I think to loop back around, I mean, I very much resist that narrative, and so that's the reason the line stuck out to me so much.
You resist which narrative?
The narrative that it's progress, right?
Yeah.
I like what you just said, that technological innovation doesn't necessarily mean progress, and also, progress for whom. And to link it to what Joan's question was, I think that it's very hard. Let me back up. It's very easy to ignore the ways that these technologies wind up being written on people's bodies and in people's spaces, particularly if you're not of and in those communities. And when I think about, for instance, like facial recognition, and the extent to which sort of a city like my city, Detroit, is in some ways overrun with cameras that have facial recognition. And in Detroit, there's a very kind of unique marker. They all have, not all of them, but many of them have a flashing green light attached to them. It's called Project Greenlight. And so if you don't know what that is, or if you're not in the city, like if you don't look at the history kind of surveillance, it's easy to think of facial recognition as a cool way that people open up their phones, right? But it's really attached to places and people in ways I think needs to be kind of more expressed, more accentuated. Yeah, I don't know.
I agree with you. One of the things that I'm facing right now in our field is everybody's really worried about vaccine hesitancy, and not surprisingly, the way this is being discussed is about Black people being vaccine hesitant. And if you construct the problem of the pandemic and vaccine rollouts as one of vaccine hesitancy, the problem is people, right? That they are their attitudes are the ones that need to shift. I live in Massachusetts. I spent, Chris, I had to cancel our meeting this morning because I spent 4 hours trying to get a vaccine appointment for my mother this morning, right? The problem is not right now, anyway, one of vaccine hesitancy. The problem is a state failing to provide access. Meanwhile, the kind of stories that we're getting about the pandemic are these stories about people being unwilling to get the vaccine rather than the state actually not having a very good plan for rollout. And I think similarly within the stories about facial recognition and tech progress is always one where they put the thing into the world and then you have to fight like hell to stop the damage that it's causing, right? And it's such it's such a growing and bigger problem within technology because of the way in which technology is being sort of used as a proxy for governance. So the failure of the state isn't a failure of the state; it's a failure of the app. The failure of messaging about this moment isn't a failure of the state; it's a failure about not having the right influencers on board to spread that messaging. And as I hear you both talk about progress or unmitigated progress, I also think about the last sort of decade in which these social media companies and these big tech companies have bought up and killed off other industries that may actually bring forth, I'm not saying progress, but things could be very, very different. And Anna, I was wondering from your perspective, especially in your journalism over the years, are there moments where you were kind of hopeful that things were going to be different or that things could have changed or that there would have been some kind of technology on the horizon that would have done a little bit of social good? You brought up a little bit about biotech having this because, for me, the weirdest part of my job is that I love technology. I am a geek. Chris is a geek. We like these things. It's just that there's something about the scale and the scope and the deployment and the like what it does to us that make us so uncomfortable and also make us have to fight back.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful all the time. I think you have to be hopeful. I wouldn't say that I've like placed that hope in any particular company at the moment, but and I've had that hope like crushed a lot. But I do think that we are in the early stages of some sort of sea change. I mean, I think this is part of why I try to, and I don't always do this well, but I do try to separate employees of these companies and from leadership. Because I just talking to people that I know or people that I'm interviewing for pieces that I'm working on, I think that there's a growing unease with the way things are going, and people are interested in leveraging the same technologies toward a different end. So I'm thinking about like the rise of, and by rise it's not like an ocean swell, it's like a full bathtub, but worker cooperatives or apps for delivery couriers, where it's not run by a large corporation that's venture funded, but it's owned and operated by the people who are making the deliveries and setting their own prices and building the relationships with vendors and whatever. That to me is really exciting and interesting. And I think that my hope, obviously that's not where the money is. The money is at Facebook, money's at Google. But my hope is that as technology becomes more accessible and cheaper, we will see a larger economy of smaller services like that, where the sort of organizational structure of the company or nonprofit behind it isn't this VC backed, founder led startup model. So that gives me hope. I mean, I think it's like every example of something hopeful in my head, it's like immediately seesawed with some example of despair. I do think a lot of people
I mean, the paradox is real, right? And what I like about what you pose here is I think a lot about, the mutual aid going on right now and the ways in which people are using what we would call minor apps or small apps, like in ways that many people wouldn't have imagined that they would get used like that. But it does, those are the kinds of things, that ingenuity of the, like in a non-derogatory way, the user, right? The way that they come to this technology and then kind of bricolage together a purpose, to me is really, to me, that's really what's at stake, is like, how do you descale these mega corporations so that they're not able to control so much of what happens across the industry, and then open up space for more and different kinds of technology and technologists as well. Like, young folks. I mean, I was a tinkerer growing up. I know one of my favorite reporters, April Glazier, was like really into radio. I mean, I feel like there are things that we learn as we go along from the cultures that we work with and that we were part of, that that there is something out there that could be hopeful. But I think you're right. Most of the ways in which we're talking about this gets back to the business model. Chris, you had a question you wanted
Yeah,
to
no,
ask from the
I'm
chat.
taking this from the chat. I think
Yeah.
this is really interesting. So the person says, I'd like to ask what kind of common narrative can work as a binding tissue between the universe of tech and communities. Programmers are also people with families, parents, social connections, and worries. In a certain way, they are the same cog in the epistemic machines as we are. What common narrative do we have? So I love this question. I just point to a couple examples. You know, I would point to some of the unionization efforts that are coming out of these big companies. Um, fights against companies making you know, tech for war, um, or things like that, or even kind of closer to home in my own field, some of the pushback from all quarters against invasive and problematic educational technologies. Um, I think perhaps for too long, people have felt that something isn't real or the harms aren't real until it affects them or their families. Um, but I do think people are breaking out of that a little bit, and partially because we're seeing a lot of societal harms. So it's not just like, is my mom hurt or is my brother hurt or something like that, but like, is society hurt? Um, and I think, so again, like, hate to keep ringing the doorbell, but like the
This is
doorbell
what
issue,
you're
right?
known for.
Like, right? Like, I hate
Yeah.
the ring doorbell, and
You do.
if I
I'm with
didn't,
you though.
hadn't made it clear, right? When one of the things that one of the employees, like an engineer at Amazon, said was, I don't think the ring program is compatible with a free and equitable society. And this is like an engineer at Amazon. Um, And so I think that more and more people are waking up to like widespread harms. And that is, I think, a thing that many of us can relate to.
Mhm.
To go back, this is such a minor, like almost frivolous comment, so forgive me, but to go back to your question, Joan, about writing place and like physical, I'm just thinking about how in recent years, walking around San Francisco, you see it. You see the little blue circle. Like I don't remember seeing that so frequently when I moved here for years. And now I would say in the last 2 years, I feel like it feels like something from a Pixar movie or something, like all the little blue lights like shining there, you know. Anyway, eh, you do see the sort of way that these things get integrated into the built environment very seamlessly. And
Mhm.
yeah, I don't know. Um,
Well, it's interesting. Roger McNamee's listening, and he's an interesting question about this as well. Around, it's not just the fact that you have people who's are getting enrolled into the tech industry. There's some of the early Fred Turner writing is really interesting here, where it used to be cool to be a techie, and it was cool because it was kind of elite and it was a kind of job that wasn't necessarily of the everydayness, right? And to talk to your point, Chris, about the need for tech worker unions and places like AI Now and Coworker that are working on those projects and those possibilities and trying to figure out that structure. A big part of it becomes possible because of this, what Roger's pointing out here about surplus technology, which is that you go from having things that are very expensive and don't really do a whole lot to things that are much cheaper, that can be operated through the cloud, and that, like, many different ideas can flourish at once, which to me points to a need for um this uh tech to be seen as an industry. Siva, who wrote the book Anti-Social Media about Facebook, often, says there's no such thing as tech, right? And I take him seriously when he says that, because we still don't know what this industry should look like. We still don't know what this industry means. And as the US dominates in terms of its position on low to no regulation, the sort of hidden rule of content online, or the hidden law of content online, is copyright, right? You can get something taken down if it violates copyright in some way, but everything else is negotiable. Um, but I'm trying to think through this question of, like, you have this global industry that is multi-billion dollar, sits at the crux of all of our social institutions and our economy and our politics, in a way that, and to kind of wrap up on this point, in a way that makes them essentially too big to legislate. From the example that we have of Australia this past week, where they had, there was some legislation around what was popularly called the link tax. And the idea was that revenue would need to be shared with news organizations. Cory Doctorow had a great thread on this. So, News Corp, of course, was going to benefit the most from this legislation, where Facebook and Google would have to share revenue around news. But there were going to be a bunch of other benefits um, that would go towards revenue streams for local news and public media. Um, in order to stop the lobbying, Google goes ahead and cuts a deal straight with News Corp, and figures they would pay out the biggest threat, whereas Facebook takes the turn of shutting off news in a moment when I mean, we're still in a pandemic, and one of the justifications for it was, well, news is only 4% of people's feeds. And I'm like, if 4% is like the only access that people are going to have to things that are close to accurate, like what else is there, right? Like what else is left? The other 96%. And so I'd love to close with some thoughts about, you know, given the enormity and the stress at which the stress that tech is putting on the rest of the world, essentially, in the world economies, the world governments, journalism, public health. Um, what could be, or what is some kind of way that we might carve out a little bit of this problem and take it on. For me, it's been working with civil society organizations, especially racial justice organizations, get out the vote campaign organizations that essentially for them, solving the misinformation problem is life and death. They can't do their advocacy if social media is able to behave the way that it does. And unionism is also another great piece of the puzzle here. But I'm wondering if you all have things in mind from your work that were just, maybe they're even just minor notes to think about, especially around business models. I mean, I think there's antitrust is on the table, what that looks like, in terms of like how you would carve out this industry, is open for debate. But I'd love to get some closing thoughts about where we might go from here and how your journalism or your research might address some of these issues. It's a big question, but these are big ideas. I mean, it's a crazy moment to be a sociologist and a journalist, for sure.
Chris, do you want to take it?
Yeah, I mean, I have a bunch of ideas. I mean, but I mean, let me go back. The last part of Roger's question, I think, is a good springboard. Role of PayPal mafia and their hyper libertarian values and changing the culture cannot be overstated. I think +1 to that. I mean, I think he's totally right. I think the question about kind of whose vision of society are we trying to create, it's really important. I mean, there's a part in the book, Anna, where you kind of say, like, what if we had different Silicon Valleys, right? Like, it's not a direct quote, but it's something along those lines. Like, what if other people were framing these discussions and making these texts and things like that? And I think that is like a tremendously important question. That you know, I, I think yeah, like that, the notion of kind of whose vision are we enacting, and there's been so much just in the past couple of years, acknowledgement that um we've been enacting maybe, I mean, I'll be explicit, we've been enacting the wrong visions, um and that the acknowledgement of the harms, as you said, Joan, are not just um they're real, and they're explicit, and they're every day. I kind of cringe when people say, well, algorithms are increasingly harming people, in their everyday lives. And it's like, no, like that is not new. Um, it's just new in the ways that people are recognizing it. But I think one of the biggest things, to even go back to some of our initial things at the beginning of this, is to think about narrative, right? And the not only kind of the stories of who creates these things and why, but the stories of people who are very real harms, whether that's from uh deep fakes and deep nudes, or non-consensual intimate imagery, or being falsely implicated by facial recognition. I think people need to see these things and hear about them in ways, um, you have to put it in people's faces in ways that they're not able to deny. I mean, I think that's one way that's really important.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Anna?
I mean, I think, yeah, with respect to narrative, that seems to be the place the corner I've carved out for myself to work in. And I think that I hope that it's useful. I hope that that the writing that I'm trying to do on technology is fair, but it also demystifies some of these narratives and contextualizes them, and maybe helps people think about what the possibilities are for building an organization that makes a product that is considered a tech product. I found, I wrote a piece a few months ago, I guess it came out in September, October, about the founder of Signal, Moxie Marlinspike, that I found to be, just in researching it and talking to him, really helpful, just thinking about the different business models for a popular consumer app, and also the sort of ideas and philosophy behind it. And I think that just it doesn't even have to be combative with these dominant narratives, but just presenting alternatives to the sort of overwhelming story that Silicon Valley has been telling about itself. I hope that's useful, because that story has been crafted, as Roger points out in the questions, by people like Peter Thiel, members of the PayPal mafia, this very influential group of wealthy men who, many of whom know each other from Stanford. And it's pervasive, and it replicates itself. I mean, and I think that they're also, it helps to, and I don't know if this is comforting or alarming, but, I think it can be helpful to think about the ways in which, as Silicon Valley, as employees at these companies begin to speak out against their employers' contracts with government agencies, with the Department of Defense, with ICE, that this actually does represent a change, because the industry was founded on relationships with the Department of Defense, with the military, and in the United States, and so actually, like, this is progress. There is work that's being done that challenges these dominant narratives that people aren't even really talking about, right? It's kind of just part of the history of the place. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's hard to sort of like understand. I don't know if it's enough to write about this, but it seems to be the one thing that I personally know how to do best. And so my hope is just sort of finding those stories and presenting different narratives or counter narratives. And I guess I do, it's been co-opted by like marketing, but storytelling I do think is very powerful and helps people understand the world they live in, and the world they could live in. So it seems to be the space I found myself in.
One other thing, Joan, to bring it
Mhm.
really full circle.
Mhm.
I joked about this. I mean, it's sort of a macabre joke, but in my local paper, there was it was the top article on the website, how to register to get the vaccine, right? And then underneath it, it said for subscribers only, you know? Um, and I mean, like, misinformation is free, but like so we gotta rethink, continue to rethink, you know, um kind of the ways that people get information, um and who pays for that and how, I mean, during the pandemic, lots of institutions, I should say, made decisions about what kinds of stories they would not hide behind a paywall. But I've seen that start to disintegrate as we don't really come out of the pandemic. Um, but just this notion that you should have to pay, you know, um, to find out where you can get like legitimate information on where to get the vaccine, or even we saw that last week that the city of Austin, Texas, was broadcasting vital information to citizens, and the only way you could get it was on Facebook Live. So, I mean, these are real serious problems. When Facebook is now critical infrastructure, um, that so again, like, these are real serious problems that we have to rethink, because that is dangerous on so many different
Well,
levels.
that brings me back to exactly where I would love to call this to a close, but I think it's important. We need a public interest internet. We do. The infrastructure's there. It's just flailing because of all of the heavy technology of platforms that's built on top of it. I talk with lots of Congress members and other folks involved in stakeholder work around the internet, and we don't have a public interest obligation that ensures that timely, local, relevant, accurate information is served to you in your timelines and news feeds. I think about it often, Chris. I think about the beginning of the pandemic where everybody was just kind of putting that band-aid on every website everywhere you went that said, there's a pandemic, it's real, here's what the symptoms are, click on this.
Right.
And we should have been ready with the amount of technology that we have. But again, it goes back to the business model, people taking more than their fair share. And, in some ways, Anna, your book really points us to this sort of morally and economically unseriousness with which tech culture takes the rest of the world, where, people are talking about billion-dollar deals and technologies and that are supposed to solve problems, and all they do is create more of them. But as I think through these problems, I'm going to look to your writing, Anna, for alternative visions of what could be, and what is already out there. I think there's so much to do. There's some great work coming out of American University about, just what are other businesses in tech doing? How are they surviving? You don't need to be everything to everyone in order to run your business. One principle that I live by is that you can live in existence without hurting other people. You really can. But it requires you to be conscious of those connections and that interconnectivity and the way in which the system is designed. And that doesn't mean turning us all into customers either. And so I really appreciate you both sticking with the conversation and thinking some deep thoughts here, because I think a lot of times, conversations like this can be a lot of storm and bluster about, what you really need to do is change the app so that it does this thing. And I got this thing where I'm going to flag all the fake news and I'm going to give you a Yelp for journalism. And I mean, I've heard it all. Um, and so I appreciate y'all having some whole of society ideas, things that journalists can do, things that workers can do, things that communities can do. Because I don't think I don't ever think about returning to a place in the world that was somehow better than the future I want to live in. Right. It's techno nostalgia is not where to go, even though I did love Napster. I just adored it. I liked Soulseek even more. But I will say that the future doesn't have to be terrible, but probably will be if we don't have voices like both of yours in the fight. So thank you for joining me, and always a pleasure. And next time we'll do it at Shorenstein. I'll take us out for margaritas after.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
I'd love that.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Thanks,
Well,
Anna.
have a
Thanks
good
everyone for
afternoon.
coming. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Bye-bye.